Night flight, a passenger who's not who he seems? What will happen at 35,000 feet? Find out right now. Subscribe, hit like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The private lounge of Dallas Executive Airport was quiet, bathed in the warm glow of recessed lights that reflected softly off polished wood and leather. A few passengers were scattered across the room, absorbed in their own worlds. The hum of distant air conditioning was the only sound, blending with faint background music that barely reached the edge of hearing. By the large window, Chuck Norris sat in a deep leather armchair, a steaming cup of black coffee resting on the table in front of him. His posture was relaxed, one leg crossed over the other, but his eyes, sharp and deliberate, took in every corner of the room. Years of martial arts training and life experience had given him an instinct that never truly rested, even in moments like these. Across from him, near the edge of the seating area, a tall man in his early 40s dropped into another armchair. He wore a tight-fitting windbreaker, the kind that seemed to strain against the width of his shoulders, and he carried himself with restless energy. His right leg bounced rapidly, fingers twitching as they played with the zipper on his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone, glanced at it, then slipped it back inside, repeating the action only moments later. Chuck noticed this pattern, the way the man's eyes flicked toward the entrance every few seconds. It wasn't the behavior of someone simply waiting for a flight. Chuck didn't stare. He'd learned long ago that the best way to observe was to appear uninterested. He shifted in his chair, took a slow sip of coffee, and let his gaze wander casually across the lounge. The man didn't seem aware he was being studied, which suited Chuck just fine. The truth was, Chuck had walked into this lounge expecting nothing more than a quiet wait before boarding his evening flight to New York. But the stranger's behavior had triggered that subtle inner alarm, the one that told him trouble might be brewing. Around them, the scene was calm, almost serene. A businessman in a navy suit worked intently on a laptop at the far end of the room. A young couple whispered to each other over a shared pastry. A flight attendant in uniform walked through with a clipboard, glancing around before disappearing into a staff-only door. Chuck's attention kept circling back to the man in the windbreaker. The way his eyes darted wasn't just nervousness. It was searching, checking for someone, maybe even more than one person. Chuck leaned back and let his mind turn over the possibilities. He wasn't quick to jump to conclusions. People fidgeted, people got nervous before flights. But something about the man's tense posture and deliberate, almost mechanical repetition of movements suggested more than just a fear of flying. The leg bouncing was constant, almost like he was burning off adrenaline he hadn't yet put to use. His jaw was tight, his shoulders hunched forward slightly, and his glances to the door had the sharpness of expectation rather than curiosity. Chuck kept his breathing even, his demeanor calm. If this man was trouble, it was better to let him believe no one had noticed. From experience, Chuck knew that preemptive action was risky without enough information. Better to watch, to wait, to let the situation reveal itself naturally. He reached for his coffee again, his gaze shifting momentarily toward the clock on the wall. The flight was still over an hour away. Plenty of time for this to unfold. The man shifted in his chair, pulling his jacket slightly tighter as if concealing something. Chuck caught the subtle movement and filed it away. A concealed weapon? Possibly, but there were too many variables to be certain yet. He decided to observe a little longer before deciding on his next move. Outside the window, a private jet was being refueled, its lights gleaming in the fading daylight. Somewhere out on the tarmac, the low rumble of an engine broke through the lounge's tranquility for just a moment before fading again. The man in the windbreaker checked his phone one more time, then looked toward the entrance with an almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging something or someone unseen. Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly. Whatever was coming, he suspected it wasn't just another passenger arriving for a routine flight. Boarding began quietly, with only a handful of passengers walking through the jet bridge toward the sleek, mid-sized private aircraft waiting outside. The hum of the lounge gave way to the muffled sounds of footsteps and the soft rustle of carry-on bags. Chuck Norris moved at an unhurried pace, his duffel slung casually over his shoulder. The man in the windbreaker was a few steps ahead, his pace brisker, shoulders slightly hunched as though he wanted to disappear into the cabin as quickly as possible. Inside, the plane's business-class seating was arranged in a 2x2 configuration, each row spacious, with leather seats that reclined almost fully. The lighting was warm, designed to give the cabin a sense of quiet comfort. Chuck settled into a window seat near the middle of the aircraft, placing his bag neatly in the overhead compartment before lowering himself into the plush leather. His eyes flicked to the right as he saw the man in the windbreaker drop into a seat 2 places away, leaving an empty seat between them. The early moments of boarding were routine. A flight attendant moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, offering bottled water and placing blankets on armrests. Passengers spoke in low voices, some already lost in their devices. The faint scent of fresh coffee and cabin air hung in the space. Chuck adjusted the seatbelt across his lap, leaning back slightly, but his gaze kept drifting toward his new cabin mate. The man avoided looking directly at Chuck, keeping his eyes on his own lap or toward the aisle, but there was no mistaking the restless energy in his movements. He shifted in his seat repeatedly, tapping his fingers against his thigh, then stopping abruptly as if aware of the noise. His hand slipped into his jacket pocket more than once, fingers brushing against something concealed. Chuck caught the movement each time, his own instincts sharpening. The plane rolled back from the gate with a low rumble, the engines building into a steady growl. As the craft taxied, Chuck turned his gaze to the window, letting the runway lights blur in his peripheral vision. He wanted the man to think he wasn't paying attention. The more relaxed his target thought he was, the more likely he would reveal his intentions without caution. When the plane lifted off, the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of flight. Seatbelt signs remained lit as the climb continued, and the flight attendants moved lightly through the aisle, checking that everyone was secure. The man in the windbreaker pulled out his phone again, shielding the screen with his hand. Chuck noted the angle of his body, the way his shoulder tilted inward, as if guarding the display from anyone nearby. He couldn't see the screen, but the man's tense jawline suggested whatever message or notification he'd received was important. Once the seatbelt light turned off, the atmosphere loosened. A few passengers reached for headphones. Others reclined their seats. Chuck accepted a glass of water from the passing attendant, nodding politely, and took a slow sip while watching the man without appearing to. The stranger's restlessness didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. His eyes flicked to the forward section of the cabin, then back again, scanning as if counting people or confirming positions. Chuck began to piece together the rhythm of his movements, the way his attention cycled between specific points in the cabin. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. He could see the wheels turning behind those eyes, and the pattern was too focused to be innocent. The thought passed through Chuck's mind that this was less about where they were going and more about what might happen before they got there. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them, and though Chuck kept his body relaxed, every muscle was quietly prepared. He had been in enough tight situations to know that a confined space like this required precision and timing. One wrong move could endanger everyone on board. He would wait. The man would show his hand soon enough. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight reached cruising altitude. Outside the windows, the night sky stretched endlessly, dotted with faint starlight. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the aisle, and passengers began to settle in for the journey. Some reclined their seats, others pulled out books or closed their eyes against the quiet hum of the engines. The air was calm, but Chuck Norris could feel the tension beneath it, the subtle current that his instincts never ignored. The man in the windbreaker shifted suddenly, His posture tightening as if he'd made a decision. Chuck caught the subtle inhale, the slight adjustment of his jacket. In one fluid motion, the man's hand disappeared inside, and when it re-emerged, it carried a compact black pistol fitted with a suppressor. The weapon was held low, angled discreetly toward Chuck's ribs, the muzzle hidden from most of the cabin. His other hand gripped the armrest, knuckles pale. "You," the man said quietly, his voice cold and deliberate. "Don't make a sound." Chuck didn't flinch. He set down the glass of water he had been holding and turned his head slowly, meeting the man's gaze without a hint of fear. "That's the worst idea you've had tonight," he replied evenly. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the man's brow furrow. "Shut up," the man hissed. "I know who you are. You're not untouchable here. Right now you're just a man in a seat." He leaned closer, the cold circle of the suppressor pressing against Chuck's side. "You're going to sit there and listen. If you move—" "If I move," Chuck interrupted calmly, "you'll regret it." The man's lips curled into a thin smile, taking Chuck's calmness for arrogance. "I've been waiting for this. You think you're some kind of hero? Let's see how tough you are at 35,000 feet. Chuck's eyes flicked briefly toward the aisle. A flight attendant was near the galley, arranging a tray of drinks. A couple of passengers shifted in their seats, sensing tension but unaware of the weapon. His gaze returned to the man, taking in every detail, the tremor in his trigger finger, the tightness of his jaw, the way his shoulders hunched forward. This wasn't a seasoned professional. This was someone running on adrenaline, desperate and dangerous. "You're making two mistakes," Chuck said quietly. "First, you think holding a gun makes you in control. Second, you just showed me you're nervous." The man's grip tightened on the pistol. "Nervous? No. I've got you right where I want you." Chuck allowed the faintest hint of a smile to form. "That's mistake number 3. You have no idea who you're dealing with." The man frowned, clearly unsettled by Chuck's composure. Most people would have been sweating, begging, or trying to talk their way out of the situation. But Chuck's stillness, the unblinking steadiness of his gaze, was unnerving. "Now," Chuck continued, his voice dropping low, "I'm going to give you one chance to put that thing away before you embarrass yourself in front of all these people." The man gave a short, humorless laugh. "You're not in one of your old action movies. There's no stunt double here. This is real." Chuck leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving the man's. "Exactly." The space between them thickened with silence. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, pressing in around them. And then it happened. The man glanced toward the galley for just a fraction of a second, checking to see if anyone was watching. It was enough. Chuck's hand shot forward, gripping the man's wrist and twisting sharply. The pistol clattered to the floor, sliding under the seat ahead. Before the man could react, Chuck's other hand clamped onto the back of his neck, driving him face first into the armrest with controlled force. The man grunted, clawing at Chuck's arm, but his movements were futile. "I told you you'd regret it," Chuck said in a voice that was almost conversational. Passengers gasped, a few rising from their seats to see what was happening. The man writhed, his earlier confidence evaporating. "You don't understand," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Oh, I understand," Chuck replied, tightening his grip just enough to make his point. "You've got 2 seconds to calm down before you lose consciousness." The man froze, his breathing ragged. Chuck eased his hold slightly but kept control. "Now you're going to sit here quietly, and when we land, you're going to meet the right people. Understand?" The man gave a stiff nod, the fight gone from his posture. But Chuck knew this wasn't over. The way the man had spoken, the way he'd looked at him, this was more than a random act. There was something bigger moving behind the scenes, and Chuck intended to find out what it was before the flight was over. Chuck kept the man pinned for another moment, feeling the rapid pulse beneath his grip. Around them, the cabin was beginning to buzz. Passengers craned their necks, whispering in uneasy tones, trying to understand what they had just seen. The flight attendant from the galley approached, her face pale, eyes darting between Chuck and the subdued man. "Sir, is everything?" she began, but Chuck cut her off with a calm wave of his free hand. "Everything's under control. Seatbelt signs still on, so let's keep everyone calm," he said evenly. She hesitated, glanced at the man's twisted posture, then nodded and backed away, retreating to the galley but keeping her eyes on them. Chuck released the man's neck slowly, sliding him upright in his seat but keeping his body turned toward the aisle. The guy sat stiffly, rubbing his wrist where Chuck had twisted it. His eyes darted nervously toward the front of the cabin. Chuck leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Now," he said, "why don't you tell me what this is really about?" "You wouldn't understand," the man muttered. "Try me," Chuck replied, his tone sharper. There was a pause, the man's gaze flicking away for just an instant. Chuck caught it, the subtle glance toward row 4. Following the line of sight, Chuck saw a man in a dark hoodie sitting hunched over, pretending to scroll through his phone. His posture was wrong, too tense for someone pretending to relax. His shoulders were tight, jaw clenched. Chuck stored the image away instantly. "You're not here by accident," Chuck said flatly. The man said nothing, lips pressed into a hard line. "You pointed a gun at me in a pressurized cabin," Chuck continued, his voice low but steady. "You're either very stupid or someone's pulling your strings." A faint smirk crept onto the man's face. "Maybe both." Chuck's eyes narrowed. "Who's in row 4? The smirk faltered. "Doesn't matter. You're not making it to New York." That was the final push Chuck needed. He gripped the man's collar and forced his gaze forward. "Listen carefully. The only way you're leaving this plane before New York is if I throw you out mid-flight." The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Chuck released him abruptly, standing to his full height. He bent, reached under the seat in front of them, and retrieved the pistol, slipping it into his own jacket. "You just became my problem for the rest of this flight," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. As Chuck stepped into the aisle, he felt the weight of row 4's eyes on him. The man in the hoodie looked up with a forced, almost casual smile. "Something wrong?" the man asked. "You've been staring at me since we left Dallas," Chuck said, leaning just slightly over him. "Your friend back there decided to make things interesting. Why don't you tell me why?" The man's fingers tightened around his phone. "I don't know what you're talking about." Chuck tilted his head, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Lying to me is like walking into traffic and hoping the cars swerve." The man's facade cracked. His eyes flicked toward the back of the cabin. Chuck followed the glance. 2 more men sat there, both pretending to nap, but their stiff posture, boots and bulky jackets told a different story. This wasn't a single attacker. This was a team. Chuck straightened, his mind already fitting the pieces together. A coordinated setup in a confined space. The man in the hoodie opened his mouth as if to say more, but Chuck raised a hand sharply. "Save it for when I decide you're worth listening to." Turning, Chuck walked back to his seat, every step deliberate. His mind was in tactical mode now. The cabin was tight, full of civilians. If these men tried something, it would have to be countered with precision and speed, no wasted movements, no unnecessary panic. He sat down, the man in the windbreaker still tense beside him. Chuck leaned close. "Your friends aren't as subtle as they think. You want to get out of this with all your bones intact? Start talking now." The man hesitated, then muttered, "It's not personal. Orders were to take you off this flight alive if possible." "Orders from who?" "I don't know the name. We got paid. That's all I need to know." Chuck's jaw tightened. "And what happens if you fail?" The man said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Whoever sent them wasn't forgiving. A chime sounded overhead as the captain's voice came through, calm and professional, announcing they'd be cruising for the next 7 hours. Chuck knew the clock had started ticking. If these men were going to make a move, it would be before the cabin sank too deeply into quiet. He settled back in his seat, eyes half closed, body loose, but every muscle ready. He'd let them make the first move, and when they did, he would make sure it was their last. The minutes stretched, each one thick with unspoken tension. The hum of the engines was steady, almost lulling, but Chuck Norris knew better than to relax. His senses were razor sharp, tuned to every flicker of movement in the cabin. The first gunman, his unwilling seatmate, sat rigid, hands clenched tightly on his knees. The man in the hoodie at row 4 kept his eyes on his phone, but his glances upward were too frequent, too deliberate. The two in the back hadn't moved, but Chuck could feel their attention, the way predators wait for the right moment to strike. He stayed still, baiting them with calm. The less he moved, the more their impatience grew. Then finally it happened. The man in the hoodie stood, stretching as if loosening cramped muscles, and walked toward the galley. Chuck's eyes tracked him without turning his head. As the man passed, Chuck caught the faint bulge under his jacket, long and narrow, the kind of outline a knife would make. A flight attendant started toward the man, perhaps to offer assistance, but Chuck gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. This wasn't her fight. The man reached the galley, but instead of heading for the lavatory, he pivoted sharply and moved down the aisle toward Chuck's row. His right hand dipped under his jacket. Chuck was already moving. He rose in one fluid motion, his hand snapping out to catch the man's wrist before the blade cleared its sheath. A sharp twist, precise and brutal, slammed the man's hand against the overhead bin. The knife clattered to the floor. Passengers gasped, some shrinking back into their seats. In the same moment, the two men in the back sprang to their feet. One charged down the aisle, the other reached into his jacket. The first gunman beside Chuck lunged toward the pistol Chuck had taken earlier, still tucked inside his jacket. Big mistake. Chuck pivoted, catching the man's wrist mid-grab, forcing it back and pinning him against the seat in a single, efficient motion. "Stay," he said, his tone like steel. The charging attacker swung a wild punch, but Chuck sidestepped effortlessly, catching his arm and using his own momentum to send him crashing face first into a row of seats. A sharp cry of pain followed, and the attacker crumpled. The last man in the back had his weapon halfway out when Chuck's eyes locked on the metal serving tray a flight attendant was holding in the galley. He snatched it from her hands without breaking stride and hurled it like a discus. The tray struck the man's wrist with a crack that made him drop the pistol instantly, the weapon skidding across the floor and under a seat. The cabin was chaos now, passengers shouting, seatbelts clicking as people leaned or stood to see. But Chuck's movements remained precise, every strike calculated. He grabbed the hoodie man by the collar and drove him backward into the bulkhead, the thud knocking the air from his lungs. "You boys picked the wrong passenger," he growled. The first gunman tried to stand again, but Chuck's backhand across the aisle seat put him down hard, not unconscious but unwilling to try again. The man who had charged from the back lay groaning, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The one with the broken wrist was clutching it, his face pale. The flight attendant stood frozen near the galley, eyes wide. Chuck gave them a curt nod. "Call the captain. Tell him we've got 4 restrained, and they'll be met by authorities when we land." One of the attackers gave a low, bitter laugh. "You think this is over? You don't know who." "I don't care who sent you," Chuck interrupted, stepping toward him so his shadow loomed over the man. "They can buy a ticket and try their luck like you did. Let's see how that works out." Silence followed. Chuck reached into an empty row, grabbing a seatbelt extender and binding the hoodie man's wrists. He motioned to 2 nearby passengers to help keep the others subdued. With the whole cabin watching, None of the attackers dared make another move. Chuck returned to his seat, breathing evenly, the pistol still secure inside his jacket. The engines hummed, the air settling into a tense quiet again. There were still hours left before New York, and that meant hours for these men to sit and stew in the knowledge that they had tried and failed to take down Chuck Norris in the most confined arena possible. And he hadn't even broken a sweat. The cabin had gone quiet again, though the silence was different now, thicker, heavier, filled with the unspoken knowledge that everyone on board had just witnessed something extraordinary. Passengers sat rigid in their seats, some stealing glances at Chuck Norris, others keeping their eyes down, unwilling to draw attention. The four subdued attackers were scattered, one strapped into his seat with a twisted wrist, another slouched in the bulkhead row with his hands bound, the man in the windbreaker still pinned uncomfortably by the seatbelt extender, and the last groaning softly with his head resting against the side panel. The flight attendants had regained some composure, but they still moved cautiously, as though afraid that any sudden action might set off another eruption. Chuck sat calmly by the window, one hand resting on the armrest, the other inside his jacket where the confiscated pistol lay hidden. He wasn't expecting them to try anything else, not with the odds so thoroughly reversed. But he stayed ready all the same. Hours stretched on. The hum of the engines was constant, the gentle sway of the aircraft a reminder that they were still thousands of feet above the earth. Occasionally, one of the subdued men would shift or glance toward another, their silent communication obvious to Chuck. But each time they met his eyes, the conversation died instantly. He took the opportunity to study them. Their clothes were ordinary enough, but their boots were military issue. Their jackets were bulky enough to hide weapons or gear, but too light for the season outside New York. Their eyes told the rest hard, calculating, but also frustrated. These were not amateurs, not completely. They were used to control, and losing it had hit them harder than the physical blows. The man in the windbreaker finally broke the silence. "You could have killed us," he said quietly, his voice low enough for only Chuck to hear. Chuck didn't look at him. "If I'd wanted to, you wouldn't still be breathing." The man swallowed, glanced at the others, then back at Chuck. "You're making a mistake. This doesn't end when we land." Chuck finally turned, his gaze sharp as steel. "You're right. It ends the moment I hand you over to the people waiting on the ground. After that, whatever happens to you is your problem." The man seemed to want to reply, but one glance from Chuck shut him down. The captain's voice broke over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into New York shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The passengers complied quickly, none more eager than the ones who had witnessed the earlier chaos. Chuck kept his eyes forward, but his senses stretched across the cabin, making sure none of the men tried to use the distraction of landing to their advantage. They didn't. Whether it was fear or simple exhaustion, they stayed quiet. The descent was smooth. Lights of the city glittered in the distance as the aircraft angled down through the clouds. The rumble of the landing gear extended beneath them, and the thud of the wheels meeting the runway followed moments later. As the engines reversed to slow the plane, Chuck glanced toward the jet bridge where flashing lights from law enforcement vehicles were already visible. When the plane came to a stop and the door opened, uniformed officers stepped aboard. The lead officer's eyes went straight to Chuck, then to the restrained men. "We'll take it from here," he said firmly. Chuck stood, stepping into the aisle, his frame blocking any attempt at sudden movement from the attackers. One by one, they were hauled up, cuffed, and led out of the cabin. The man in the windbreaker looked back once, but Chuck's expression made him turn away instantly. With the last of them gone, the air in the cabin seemed to lighten. Passengers began to murmur again, some even smiling in relief. A flight attendant approached Chuck with gratitude written across her face. "Thank you," she said softly. Chuck gave a small nod. "Just another flight," he replied, picking up his duffel bag. He was the last to leave, stepping out into the cool night air of the tarmac. The police were loading the four men into separate vehicles. Chuck paused, watching as the doors slammed shut. There was no satisfaction in his face, only the steady focus of someone who knew the job wasn't truly over. Whoever had sent them was still out there. He slung the bag over his shoulder and walked toward the terminal. 7 hours earlier, they had thought they could control him. Now they knew the truth. At 35,000 feet or on solid ground, you didn't come after Chuck Norris unless you were ready to lose. You've just seen how calm can turn into chaos in seconds. Want to know what happens next? Subscribe, hit like, and let us know in the comments which city or country you're watching from.